Support for this video comes from Skillshare, which offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. Portraits are without a doubt one of the most powerful forms of art. To capture someone's likeness, their expression, their emotion, and transmit that through paint, pencil, or material, an effect within the viewer and emotion, is almost magic. But the magic in this portrait of a young Dutchman has been harmed by the painting's condition. Upon first glance, the painting appears to be okay, but as we take a closer look, we can see that there's a yellowed varnish, surface grime, and various areas of loss throughout the painting, all conspiring against us. A raking light shows us a massive tear through the sitter's head, and we can see that at one point this painting was actually an oval and was cut down to fit a rectangular format. The corners were inlaid with canvas, but these are clearly visible and again destroy the magic. The frame for which this painting has been cut down is also damaged, with significant losses throughout all of the edges. Areas are split and coming apart, and even the frame was cut down, and this odd piece of wood inlaid on the bottom to make it fit the painting. Under a UV light examination, though it's difficult to see, we can identify areas of retouching. The tear across his face, areas in his hair where the paint was removed during a previous cleaning, all along the face where little losses have been, something funny going on with his beard, and of course the corners, which are very clearly visible as overpaint, along with all sorts of areas within his shirt. But this is a stunning portrait, or at least it will be once we're done with the work that's required. And while portraiture is one of my favorite forms of artwork, I know from experience just how difficult it can be to get started and make sense of creating a face. But with Skillshare, it doesn't have to be. Skillshare is the all-in-one platform for expanding knowledge, learning, and creativity with thousands of courses, including courses on portraits, like this one by Gabrielle Bricky. Gabrielle's a multimedia artist, and she'll take you through some basic steps of creating portraits, from materials, paper, pencils, all sorts of erasers that you might need, and blending tools. She'll help you understand how to build a portrait from form and shape to shadow, texture, line movement, and even understanding a little bit of anatomy. She'll give you a comprehensive toolkit with which you can start creating your own portraits. The class has a lesson plan so that you can follow along, and it has a comprehensive outline of what you're going to learn, everything from steps and materials. I had college professors that didn't even do this. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so get started today and explore your creativity. As with most projects, this one included, the first step is taking things apart and separating the painting from the frame, and we have some plans for that frame, but you'll have to stick around for that. Also removing this painting from the stretcher, and because this canvas was glue-lined, adhered to a new piece of canvas, I'm going to simply slice off the lining canvas from the stretcher. It's a lot faster and easier than digging out all of these rusted tacks. I still need to do that, but I can do that later on during another step where I have some downtime. There are no tacking edges on this painting, so I don't have to worry about damaging the original. Remember, it was cut down from an oval to fit this rectangular format. Using my palette knife, I'll go around the perimeter, making sure that I've separated the canvas from the stretcher, and then I can simply remove it. This stretcher needs to be cleaned, but again, I'll do that when there's downtime. The next step of separation, or taking things apart, is removing the lining canvas from the painting. And I know that these corners were inlaid. I can simply pull them back and I can see what looks like, well, gauze and canvas, which is interesting. You never know what you're going to discover when you start taking old work apart. And here I'm just prying back and peeling back that lining canvas so that I can reveal the original. And this lining was executed with rabbit skin glue. And yeah, it is what it sounds like. And this was really common historically. Some conservators still use it now, but we don't, for a lot of reasons that I can get into later on. This lining needs to come off because we have to address the tears and the inlaid corners, which we can see and are failing. But I mentioned that gauze, and here you can see that a gauze layer was laid down into the wet rabbit skin glue before the canvas layer was then laid on top of it. And this is an interesting approach, and one that I will replicate when I do my lining, but with new modern materials that are easier to remove and have a less likely chance of failing over time. Once I've removed that lining canvas, I can then start peeling off the gauze. And this gauze is really deteriorated. You can see that as I'm working to peel it off, it just kind of breaks apart into lots of little pieces. This is one of the effects of saturating materials, whether they be gauze or canvas, with rabbit skin glue. The water and the glue itself start to break down these natural fibers, and over time they become incredibly brittle, and then they start to fail, and when we try to remove them, they're incredibly difficult. Not that that's anything that's really important. The conservator's plight is their own, and complaining about it falls on deaf ears. The removal of this gauze continues, albeit slow going, but I need to get all of it off so that I have access to this raw rabbit skin glue, because I have to remove that as well. I want to reveal just the canvas and get all of this old work, all of these old materials that have failed off. Now, these materials were not bad choices. They were probably the peak of technology at the time, but now we can do better, and we intend to. With the rabbit skin glue exposed, I can now begin removing it with a gelled water called laponite. This is a synthetic clay that when mixed with water turns the water into a gel, and it's easier than using free water because it doesn't make a mess and it doesn't evaporate as quickly, allowing us to have a little bit more control. I'll take a brand new scalpel blade and I'll dull it on a honing stone because I want a blunt edge so as to not cut the canvas. And then the scraping begins. After letting the rabbit skin glue sit with exposure to the laponite, because it's a hygroscopic material, meaning that it'll absorb ambient moisture, it will pull all the moisture from the laponite and swell and soften up. And then I can take my dulled scalpel, glide across the surface, and remove all of this rabbit skin glue. After removing the rabbit skin glue, I'll take some blotter paper, which is natural rag paper, acid-free, and highly absorbent, and I'll lay it down and then put a weight on it, because there's still some moisture trapped in that canvas, and if I don't do this step, the canvas will likely distort. Now, I can correct that later on, and I will, but if I can keep it from distorting too much, it's to my benefit, and also the painting's benefit. And then we do it again. The process of removing an old adhesive, particularly rabbit skin glue, is slow going and time consuming. One thing that I'm doing to help speed up the process is applying some of the laponite ahead of the area I'm scraping, so that while I'm scraping, the rabbit skin glue has time to absorb that moisture and swell. Every time I clean an area off, I move the blotter paper and the weights over, again to prevent the distortion. Something as simple as a little bit of weight and this absorbent blotter paper can really do a lot in keeping the canvas flat. And one thing that I'm impressed with is the relative consistency with which this rabbit skin glue was applied, and also mixed for that matter. Because it's a natural material and has to be manually applied, there can be a lot of variations, and those variations can speak to poor or rushed work. But this wasn't that. This was good work, just old. Now, even though I've done a spectacular job scraping off the rabbit skin glue, there's still some embedded in the canvas. And so I'm taking an old toothbrush with a little bit of water, and I'm just going to start scrubbing the back of the canvas. And you can see there is some rabbit skin glue coming up. Once I've gotten it loose, then I'll take a cotton ball, and I'll just try to absorb as much as I can. And I'm going to do this once or twice, just to remove all of the remnants, well, at least as much as is possible without really soaking this canvas. The only way to fully remove all of this material would be to wash this canvas, which would be possible for a textile, but not for a painting, because of course, washing a painting would yield a raw piece of canvas with no painting anymore. And now that the canvas has a higher content of moisture in it, I'm going to transfer it over to the hot table, which I've already heated up, onto a piece of blotter paper with a nylon release film underneath. That's the green thing. And then I'll create an envelope with Mylar. I'll put through bag connectors in the corners, which will allow me to extract the air and apply even pressure on this painting. I'll lower the pressure because I just want a little bit. Too much can be harmful. And then I'll let the painting sit as it cools. This is going to extract some of the moisture that we added, and it's going to allow the painting to be pressed flat. Once the table is cool, at least to room temperature, I can remove the painting from this envelope and then transfer it over to another table where it will continue to rest for a couple of days. I'll use the blotter paper that I previously used, but I'll flip it over so the dry side is accessible. And then, once I've placed the painting on top of it, I'll cover this painting with a piece of felt. And this felt does a couple of things. It can protect the paint layer, it can compensate for any impasto, though this painting doesn't have any, and it also can distribute the pressure of these sheets of sheetrock or drywall more evenly so that we can ensure that there are no gaps in this pressure, which could lead to distortions. And we've just spent a lot of time trying to get rid of those distortions. While the painting was on the hot table and I had a little bit of downtime, I worked on the stretcher. I had to use a lot of moisture to soften up the rabbit skin glue and the old paper tape that was put on to tidy up the back. Cleaning a stretcher not only, cleans it and makes it suitable for the painting, but it allows me to examine the support to make sure that there's no damage that I otherwise need to correct. If there is, we will, but in this case, the stretcher is great. We don't need to replace it or fix it. It just needs a good scrubbing. After the canvas has had a few days under weights, allowing it to acclimatize to the studio's temperature and relative humidity, we can remove it. And we're hoping that we don't find any big distortions. As I roll back the felt, we can see that the painting is mostly flat, save for the big tear. And addressing the tear starts with some of the stock material that I have. These are cutoffs of PET film that I use for Interleaf linings, and they already have the adhesive on both sides. Instead of throwing these out, I keep them because every once in a while, like today, they come in handy. But they do need some modification. This one is too big. And I'll trim it down by first aligning it with the corner and then pulling it back about 1/8 inch on each edge. I want it a little bit smaller than the stretcher because this PET film doesn't flex, and if it's larger, I can't stretch it to the stretcher. I'll mark the PET film, I'll cut it, and then I'll start preparing this painting for the next step. I need to create inlaid corners, just like the last conservator, to return this painting to a rectilinear format. I discussed with my client the possibility of returning it to an oval format, but that presented a problem in the fact that we have a rectilinear frame, and creating an oval frame is a big expense. Maybe for a known painting of somebody important by somebody important, my client would have felt it was worth it, but for this painting, which is merely decorative to them, they felt that keeping it rectilinear was an okay decision. It was a compromise that they had to make, but life is full of compromises. I'll cut out all of the corners and then I'll inlay them to fit. I have to do this for each corner, and then once I'm done, I'll secure them in place with a little bit of tape. This painting still has surface grime and old varnish on it, so the application of the tape to the face isn't something that I'm terribly concerned about. I'll bring the painting over to the back and I'll start preparing it for the interleaf lining process. Much like the previous conservator used an interleaf in between the interleaf, the gauze, I'm going to be using a flat spun nylon gossamer. Unlike the gauze, this won't deteriorate because it's a synthetic material, and instead of using rabbit skin glue, I'm using a conservation grade adhesive that's both heat and solvent activated. Now, the reason for this layer of flat spun nylon gossamer is to A, allow a little bit thicker application of adhesive without being too gummy or too messy, and also B, to hold those pieces of inlaid corners in place while I remove the tape and prepare the painting for the lining. And you can see that the tape did no damage to the surface of the painting. I'll cut off all of this extra nylon gossamer with a really sharp blade, and simply dragging it along the edge of the painting makes a really nice tight cut. We don't need any of this excess material, and it kind of looks goofy if it sticks around, so we trim it off. And then I can begin preparing the lining materials. I'll adhere a piece of film adhesive to the lining canvas. I'll orient the PET film to the painting and tack it in place in the corners so it doesn't shift during handling. And then I'll put that onto the lining canvas and again tack it in place. Once that's all done, I'll check it on the stretcher and then transfer it over to the hot table, which I've already heated up and is a little unpleasant to be touching, but such is life. I'll prepare all of the materials and then I'll apply the vacuum pressure. The heat will activate the adhesive and create a bond, while the pressure makes sure that there's even distribution and we have a good joint. I'll roll over the painting with some brayers and rollers just to be sure. In order to keep the new lining canvas clean, I'm going to apply some basic blue painter's tape around the perimeter. It would be a shame to all of a sudden make this a filthy canvas when I've spent so much time trying to keep it nice, tidy, and clean. So this tape goes a long way. what a difference. But my work is not done. There was paper tape wrapped around the stretcher and onto the face of this painting, and I need to remove that. So after applying a little bit of water to the edge of this paper tape and allowing it to sit, I can begin scraping it off. And I have to do this step after removing the old varnish because the varnish was on top of this paper tape and the water won't penetrate that varnish layer. So I have to clean the painting in order to clean the painting. Sometimes we have to do things in odd orders that don't make sense until you see them, and then it makes sense. So after scraping it off, I can come back with a little bit of water and remove all of the excess residue and the adhesive. And now we have a nice clean edge. But my scraping doesn't stop there. There are areas of fill-in that I can clearly tell are excessive. So taking my scalpel, I can go over them and pick them off. This fill-in should not be on top of the original paint. Fill-in is only supposed to go where there are losses, not where there's original paint. And so this was excessive and sloppy. Speaking of sloppy, when I do my fill-in, I want to again keep the painting clean. So more blue painter's tape. And I'm using a chalk-based fill-in to, well, fill in the losses. We need something to retouch on where the paint has disappeared because of flaking or because there's a tear or hole. And this chalk-based fill-in will do just that. I'm lucky in that this painting doesn't have a lot of impasto, or really any, so I don't have to build up texture, I just need it smooth. And in the areas where I've inlaid the canvas in the corners, I need to build up quite a bit. And I'll go over this a couple of times until I've got a satisfactory layer. And it takes a couple of passes, feeling your way through it, removing some, doing it again, but eventually I'll get there. And then after the fill-in has been allowed to dry for a couple of hours or a day, I'll come back with some swabs and begin removing the excess. Unlike the previous conservator, I don't want any of this fill-in on top of the original paint. That's just something that's not acceptable to me. So by using a dampened cotton swab and my fingers, I can lightly abrade the surface and get rid of all of that fill-in. I can remove the painter's tape and we can see everything is nice and tidy and ready for stretching. Now this painting doesn't technically need to be on a stretcher because the interleaf will immobilize the canvas. It can't have tension added to it and it can't expand and contract, creating ripples or waves like a normal canvas would. But this is the stretcher we have, and it's good, so there's really no reason to replace it with something like a strainer, which is a fixed, rigid support that doesn't have the ability to be keyed out. I'll use steel tacks to stretch this painting and affix it to the stretcher, and then I'll start trimming off and cleaning up the back. The previous conservator glued this stuff down to the back of the stretcher, but we don't do that here. We fold it under and we use smaller tacks to tack it in place. It's just tidier, it's cleaner, it's neater, and I like the way it looks. Once this is all complete, then I can go ahead and put the keys into the support. Now, even though this support doesn't need to be keyed out, these will help hold it in place, and also I don't want to omit them because they came with the stretcher. Once in place, I'll bind them with a little bit of fishing line so they don't get lost, and then we can start preparing the painting for retouching. Because of the inlays, and because this is a dark painting, I'm applying this synthetic resin layer atop the painting. And this is going to do a couple of things. It's going to help fill in any little deviations that I didn't catch with my fill-in material, and it's going to create a beautifully saturated palette for me to retouch on. With all the retouching done, it's time for final varnish, which will both protect the painting from ultraviolet light and from surface handling, but also allows me to control the sheen. I'll apply it with a brush, simply enough, back and forward, and I just want to get the varnish on the painting. Once I do that, then I can start going back and forth and evening it out. And finally, I'll brush out this varnish. As the solvent evaporates, the varnish gets stiffer, and I can add a slight texture with this and another brush to give it a really beautiful surface finish. So here he is, before and after. And what a change, if I do say so myself. The biggest thing is that the painting is clean, and now we can see his white ruff that's not yellow. The corners have been remedied. They're no longer distraction. The tear has been fixed. We've restored his beard, and overall, the painting just looks, well, spectacular, as a portrait should. And what about the frame? Oh, well, stay tuned next time to see the solution that we've come up with. I think you'll enjoy it.